When we looked at the book of Job, we were beginning there to look at the Old Testament wisdom literature. We continue that in this session with the book of Proverbs, which is the other main book of Old Testament wisdom. And we're going to use this also as a time to mention two smaller books, Ecclesiastes, which is also part of the wisdom literature, and Song of Songs, which is not. I think this is the right time to say something about the background to the Old Testament wisdom literature. It has quite a developed background in both Egyptian and Babylonian culture. In both of those societies, it was a formal scheme for training recruits to the civil service, a mechanism by which one generation could warn the next how to succeed in their work and how not to rock the boat. I think it's fair to say that the Old Testament wisdom teaching is never quite such a straitjacket as that, but it is still one generation's attempt to shorten the process by which their descendants will learn the basic skills of life. The three samples we're going to take, we're going to look at wisdom itself from the book of Proverbs, and then an extract from Ecclesiastes, and then we're going to look at the Song of Songs. In Proverbs then, for our first sample, we need to turn to chapter 9. Most of the book of Proverbs consists of one-line sayings. They may be grouped by theme, by keywords, or by no discernible scheme. Some people are able to remember lots of these proverbs and quote them at appropriate moments. My mind doesn't work like that at all. I find this book very difficult to get hold of, except that is for the first 9 chapters. These chapters are more continuous, so I'm able to follow them. They're all about wisdom and what a good thing it is to undergo teaching so that you acquire wisdom. It happens that in both Hebrew and Greek, the two languages which are important for the Old Testament, the word for wisdom is feminine. Remember the genders of words in French and German and so forth? Well, they had them in those languages too. So it's a workable trick to speak in either Hebrew or Greek of wisdom as a person who naturally therefore has to be a female. You'll remember that at the beginning of John's Gospel, the word or logos is treated as a person, and a person who is all tied up with God in everything from the creation of the universe up to the settling of our eternal destinies. And many people say that in writing that way, John was riding on the backs of those who had done something a little bit similar in the Old Testament in treating wisdom as a person. In the Old Testament, wisdom isn't quite as closely tied up with God as is the Logos in John's prologue, but it's something in that direction. Well, this part of Proverbs, this sort of continuous part of Proverbs, ends and climaxes in chapter 9. So that's what we're going to be looking at. If you read, please, the first 6 verses of Proverbs 9. This section is almost evangelical. Wisdom wants to be a part of everyone's life, so she's prepared a lavish party and sets about inviting all and sundry. And in particular, she wants to draw in those who are simple and those who lack judgment. Well, I don't see any problem with referring to some people as lacking judgment and therefore needing wisdom. But what about calling some people simple? That clearly can't mean what it means if you call someone a sort of country bumpkin and call them a little bit simple. What delightfully preserving the old ways you might have referred to once as 11 halfpenny for a shilling, or someone whose lift doesn't quite reach the top floor. That's usually being unwarrantably rude about a person, but that sort of attitude has been attached to referring to someone as simple. Don't think it can mean that at all. Neither can it mean that what the contemplatives mean by simplicity, which they gain almost in a Buddhist way by ridding themselves of all the complexities of life, so that without that baggage they're free to contemplate the Lord. I don't think it can mean either of these, because the one of them isn't cured by teaching and the other is a sort of virtue anyway. I think that in this context, simple has to mean that someone is in that sort of innocence which is really ignorance. They've not taken account of things which they could and probably should have taken on board, and as a result their attitude to life is possibly almost criminally naive. They go blundering through life, blissfully ignorant of issues which they really ought to learn about. So what wisdom wants them to do is to take instruction, to come under her teaching, and so be able to take account of those deeper issues of life. Well, perhaps this is a point at which we ought to say a little bit about what wisdom really is. When I'm teaching statistics, I often have to distinguish for students between data and information. With raw data, although all the facts may be there, you can't see what they mean unless someone analyses them or summarises them or pictures them in some way. And then the importance of the data can be communicated. It can be used to inform you and other people of the significance of the data. Data has become something that can inform. It has become information. If I'm in the mood to blether, if you can imagine that, I go on to muse on what might become of that information. Information, shall we say, you pass on to a manager. And receiving that information, he or she acquires knowledge. If they reflect on that knowledge, they may acquire understanding. If they have the gift of using that knowledge and understanding at the right time and in the right way, you would say then that they have wisdom. So to be able to use wisdom, you need a base of knowledge and understanding. And wisdom is a description of how well you deploy that knowledge and understanding in real life. So, at the end of verse 6, wisdom has invited the simple to come and take what she can give, and the result of that is that they will have understanding and will be able to conduct their lives on the basis of that understanding. Would you read, please, verses 7 to 9? A mocker is someone who not only lacks wisdom, but actively makes fun of those who are wise. If you criticize such a person using godly criteria of what is good or wise, then you're likely to get more of an earful from them than you usually get. So don't do it. To quote a proverb, boom boom, don't cast your pearls before swine. That Proverbs in Matthew 7 verse 6. We have a peculiar version of this in this country, in that it's one of the few places on this earth where being clever is regarded with suspicion or worse. In other words, we tend to be a society of mockers, looking for ways to take people down a peg if they seem brighter than we are. That's a very negative and dangerous attitude and habit for a society to get into. I've had the experience of teaching a class of teenage boys, say something essential like maths, and it's not unusual to find that those of an Asian background will be eager to learn and they're a pleasure to teach. They're likely to achieve their full potential. But among those of a working class culture, the white British boys seem to be compete with those of an African background, vying with each other to see who can despise learning the most. That's tragic. Those youngsters grow up with a chip on their shoulder, and though they may loudly blame others for their misfortune, the chip is almost entirely of their own making. They are convinced mockers, and it's painfully hard to try and teach them anything. So mockers, that's a vitally important word for us to understand. And it's much the same with those who are wicked, that is, those who've not adopted the Lord's standards of goodness. Don't waste your insights on them unless they give you a clear invitation to do so. But if someone is wise, and you give them some information or insight which could make them even wiser, then they're quite likely to be gracious and grateful for your contribution. Verse 9 increases wisdom through instruction and increases righteousness through teaching. The underlying ethos of the wisdom movement was that the right way to live has been discerned over the generations by various people, so that those who have themselves taken instruction are in a position to pass on that teaching to the next generation. This comes over as rather strange to a lot of people these days, that essentially all you need to know about life is already known to previous generations, and you therefore need to take instruction from them. These days people are much more concerned to do their own thing, possibly to generate for themselves a fresh approach to life, and they don't take kindly to being instructed by a load of old fuddy-duddies, who obviously don't know a thing about living. They can't do because they're old. For some years now the church I belong to has set out to behave on a Sunday within a culture which connects with the society around us. But of course there are times where you come up against a feature of our society's culture which is simply wrong and which needs to give way to something more godly. And I would hope that within a church which has this sort of contemporary attitude, there's sufficient respect for wisdom that a constructive criticism gets a decent hearing. And there's something else about wisdom before we proceed. A lot of wisdom in Proverbs and elsewhere is just everyday common sense distilled into a teachable form. Some of it, however, does have a direct reference to God and only makes sense within the framework of faith. But time to read on. Would you read, please, verses 10 to 12? In order for you to take instruction, to acquire wisdom, there has to be some basis upon which you have respect for the people who've journeyed ahead of you. And the most obvious cause of such respect is that you allow God to assume the position of your Lord in your life, and that you therefore take heed of what he directs into your life, in particular if he channels it through people who are older than you are. For the last section of this poem, wisdom invents another personification which is her opposite, another woman called Folly. Would you read, please, verses 13 to 18? In verse 17, whatever the naughty delights of doing something you know you shouldn't do, in verse 18, to be in the company of folly is to have the seeds of death in your life. The conclusion then is, if you want wisdom, you must take instruction for those who have gone before. You must allow the Holy Spirit working in you to bring to life those elements of their teaching which you must take on board, and then you must find the way to enshrine those elements in your own life, using your knowledge, using your understanding, and applying them with true wisdom throughout your life. I very much hope that our children and grandchildren will have the delight of exploring this world for themselves and developing their own ideas and skills. But I also hope that they will have the good grace to listen to their elders and take seriously the idea that previous generations may have something useful to teach them. That's wisdom, and it concludes our first sample. Our second sample in this session is our other exploration of part of the Hebrew wisdom literature, the book Ecclesiastes. The very first thing we need to do is to look at that word Ecclesiastes. In the very first verse of Ecclesiastes, there is a word that for the person behind this document. In Hebrew, the word is koheleth. The trouble is that no one knows what that word means, and it seems to have something to do with the Hebrew for assembling people. So the old Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, called him Ecclesiastes, that is the church person, because church people gather people, I suppose. NIV takes a different line and calls him the teacher, because teachers gather people for lessons. both those words are guesses, but the word Ecclesiastes has at least stuck as the name for the book. To be honest, it's a miserable book. A large part of the book wallows around in self-pity along the line that life is meaningless and it's awful. And the Koheleth eventually draws the conclusion that in the face of this meaningless, you might as well eat, drink and be merry. That's chapter 8, verse 15. That is, get whatever obvious enjoyment you can out of life because there's nothing else. That, of course, is not what the rest of the Bible says. So this immediately presents us with a problem. And I think that the most obvious solution is that whoever wrote this book was probably going through a pretty bad patch in life when he did so. So we can take most of the book as describing that human condition which needs to be addressed by the goodness and the grace of God. It's a statement of the problem rather than anything that we could accept by way of a solution. Well, if you think it's a bit strange that such a book is in the Bible, there is one obvious reason reason for it. A wisdom book starting as this one does with its verse 1 makes it sound as if the book was written by Solomon, the hero of the wisdom movement, and that thought probably got the book into the Old Testament. I'm not aware of any evidence that Solomon was ever as negative as the thoughts that dominate this book, so I don't fall for the argument that he was its author. My guess is that it was written by someone later than Solomon, who started with that verse in a pale attempt to link the book to the hero of wisdom. It just proves that you can fool some of the people some of the time. Chapter 3, which is what we're going to look at, is less miserable than most of the rest of the book, and so it shouldn't do us too much damage to spend some time on it. If you'll read, please, the first 8 verses of chapter 3. This is about the only part of this book that's widely quoted. There was even a song based on it, in the 60s, I think it was. It's not the most profound piece of all time. In fact, we have to disagree with its very first verse, which says that every activity has its proper time. I'm at a loss to see how strangling one's mother-in-law would ever be something that had its proper time. Obviously, there are activities that are wrong and cannot be included in this observation. Apart from that, yes, it's a bit on the obvious side that activities which are permissible are sometimes the appropriate thing to do and sometimes not. Read the next bit, verses 9 to 14. In this section, the writer almost takes off, but I think crashes at the end of the runway. He's relating everything to the sovereignty of God, so that's a good start. But you're left not knowing whether he's pleased with our lot under God or not. On the one hand, he gets close to saying that there is a God-shaped hole in each of us, but then he seems to think that doesn't get us anywhere, and what we're left with is making the best of a burdensome situation which the Lord has put us into. I would also take issue with the way that verse 12 is expressed, that the best thing we can hope for is to be happy and to do some good. I'm not convinced that being happy should be our aim. Happiness is one of those things that sometimes comes and sometimes doesn't. It's a reaction of our emotions to our circumstances. Better, I would have thought, to seek joy and peace, knowing that our lives are secure in the Lord's hands, and then, if our emotions and our circumstances bring us a sense of happiness some of the time, accept it gratefully as a bonus. But I think it's a silly word to put up front. Read, please, verses 15 to 17. 15 is a restatement of something from the first chapter, that there's nothing new under the sun. It seems that the main force of this for Koheleth is to emphasize his sense of tedium, of there being no likelihood of anything happening which will relieve his sense of meaninglessness. That is at best a dangerous half-truth. I mean, when Jesus appeared on the scene, that was something pretty much new and made everything before it old. And the Lord's purpose is that in the end he will make all things new. Verse 16. This is an observation on the way that things are in the world around Koheleth. It's a judgment very similar to that of the prophets like Amos and Isaiah, that people who carry the responsibility for ordering society are corrupt and self-seeking. Well, that's an observation which is bad enough for us today, but it was an awful lot more damning for a nation whose political leadership and spiritual leadership were the same group of people, because they believed they were the Lord's chosen people. For leaders in such a nation as that to get it regularly wrong was a lot more offensive. Verse 17. Again, not hugely profound, and again made seriously out of date by the New Testament. What we've studied, for instance, in Paul about justification by faith needs to be brought into the picture to counter what this verse says. Would you read then, please, verses 18 to 22? This is another part of this book which challenges particularly the New Testament to update it. I mean, to describe mankind as in exactly the same position as the animals is to say, presumably, that we have no soul, no prospect of life after death. So it's a pretty negative and miserable way of looking at things. Verse 21. Koheleth appears to acknowledge that this is not what everyone believes, but he says that he's not convinced by the point they make. Verse 22. The only safe line he feels free to take is to get what he can out of the life that he knows and not count on there being anything else. I think that we have to say that this being written there in the Old Testament amounts to a desperate cry which provokes the Old Testament itself, let alone the New Testament, to shout in return, no, there has to be more to it than this. So perhaps you might like to think of this miserable little book as the grain of sand in the oyster, the aggravation which causes a beautiful pearl to form. Take the book as an annoyance which drives you to look for something more, something you'll find readily enough in both testaments of the Bible. But that brings our second sample to a conclusion. The Song of Songs is not a part of the wisdom literature, so it's a cuckoo in today's nest of wisdom books, but it's the next one in our Bibles and we have to mention it somewhere, so we'll look at it now. If you thought it was a problem why such a miserable book as Ecclesiastes is in the Bible, you've probably got a worse problem making sense of an erotic love poem being the next book. I don't think there's any sense in trying to pretend that Song of Songs is anything other than an erotic poem. I'm not going to sit here and read you the bits that prove it. I mean, you probably found them all out for yourselves. But there are a couple of things we ought to do by way of looking at this book. The first is to ask, why is it in the Bible? As far as I can see, the answer is likely to be the same as for Ecclesiastes, that at some stage the name of Solomon got attached to the book, and people thought that if it was Solomon's book, then it's an important part of their heritage and therefore ought to be in the Bible. I'm not convinced by the suggestions that Solomon had anything to do with it, but that's a separate issue. The other issue is that seeing that this book is in the Bible, what do we do with it? I suppose you could say that we should meditate on it in order to make us into better lovers. But to be honest, you're not going to find many pulpits where the preacher has enough bottle to commend that use of the book and illustrate it. By far the most common use of this book is to take it as an allegory of the love relationship between ourselves and the Lord, and then to trawl through the book to find odd bits which we can directly use as addressed to the Lord. This approach is especially liked by certain kinds of old-style preachers. It was an approach that once dominated, particularly the interpretation of the Old Testament, but it feels rather dated these days. And there are just lots of Christians these days who think that that using Song of Songs in this way is a little bit over the top. I think that the only excuse for us to spend time in this course on the Song of Songs is to use it as a mine for what we might say to the Lord, or what we might think lovingly of the Lord, and look for bits that could be used to express that. But treating the book in that way very much is not my thing. So this is a DIY session. This is a challenge. I'm going to make suggestions, but I'm going to leave you to it and see if you can find in the Song of Songs turns of phrase or ideas that you feel are useful to you in what you address to the Lord. If you want suggestions, I would say look particularly in chapter 2 and in chapter 7, but you can look anywhere and have a good time. I'm going to leave you at this point.